um, thanks, on this subject, but that's not the purpose of today. We really want to dig deep into the topic with Malcolm, but I thought it would be useful to just give you some basic information first and go through that so that we've got everyone kind of on the same field. So I'll share my slides. Okay, look for a thumbs up from Dorothy. Excellent. Okay. So yeah, just wanted to start with some facts for you. You know, what is the current landscape for collective voice at the moment? So you'll see on the screen there that actually 2022 and 2023 had the lowest union membership rates since 1995. So it has been declining over the last 4 decades, but actually that decline has slowed. The decline is mostly in the private sector. And then there's also the fact that there was some legislation introduced, the Trade Union Act in 2016, and also the Minimum Service Levels Act. And that one's proposed to be repealed. But those, well, had the perspective of restricting the union's ability to strike an impact on the collective voice. But there is a big but. In Scotland, we've got the Fair Work Convention, and that's increasing in awareness as well. So anyone who works in the public sector, or if you go through tendering process, you'll be familiar with the framework. An effective employee voice is a big part of that framework. So it talks about the benefits of employee voice as well. So it's a powerful feedback mechanism. It helps you implement change in a smoother way, and it gives you a heads up on potential problems in advance. But we see the landscape is changing. And I've put up, this is from the Labour Manifesto, and I'm sure that everybody here will have read something in the news recently about the draft employment bill. So we're all aware that there's going to be a bigger focus on improving the collective voice, and now we've got the government focusing on it as well. But how is it going to change? So that time will tell, but there are some significant changes that are proposed with the employment bill. So they've announced several ways to boost the presence at work, giving them access to workplaces so that there's more interaction between the trade unions and potential members. The requirement for employers to inform the employees about the right to join a trade union. So is that going to be a line in the contract, for example? How big an impact that will have, we're not sure at this time, but it is important that that's being made a focus. And then also reducing the red tape for union recognition as well, so making it a lot easier. So what we are finding is that it is opening up conversations about how to have an effective structure for employee voice. So we don't know the impact yet, but we are starting to talk about it. And we're having more conversations with our clients about what effective employee voice could look like for them and how to approach it. So would it be better to have a trade union recognition agreement, or how about a workplace forum? Would that work better? The other thing that we've been thinking about is that for some colleagues, whether they're in HR or management, they might not actually have experience of working with industrial relations, especially because there has been a decline over the last 4 decades. It's a long time. But there might be others who have outdated experience or training. So they've had training decades ago, and now they're not familiar with what consultation and collective bargaining actually looks like in 2024. So some interesting thoughts. So apologies to those who are familiar with the ICE regulations already. It's not new legislation, but it is hugely important for growing organisations to be aware of. So I've put some basic key points of the regulations on the slide. We refer to them as ICE within the profession, but it is Information and Consultation of Employees Regulations 2004. And it kicks in when an organisation has 50 or more employees. And there is a very low trigger point. So it's just 2% of the workforce that is required for triggering the regulations. Why they were established, it was to give employees a statutory right to be informed and consulted. And what it requires is the establishment of a workplace forum. It requires an agreement to be negotiated, outlining the topics to be included, the frequency of the meeting, any confidentiality. And of course, there's a requirement to have reps. But it's important to plan ahead and think about whether the internal forum is preferable to a recognised trade union. And we'll delve into this in more detail with Malcolm. So what about the role of HR in promoting employee voice? Again, this is hugely important. And as the slide shows, HR has several important ways that we can contribute and make sure that the relationship is effective. Doing it well takes skills, for example, mediation, facilitation. You need to have training so that you understand what the difference is between informing and consulting. You need to have knowledge of the structure as well, and make sure you know what the responsibilities are for each party, what the roles are, and what expectations are as well. But behaviours are really important too, and that's definitely something that Malcolm will pick up with us. So confidence and courage to help move disputes forward. So that just gives you a bit of background information, what we'll be picking up on in my conversation with Malcolm. So we'll pause the slides now, and I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to dig deeper with you, Malcolm. Malcolm's well known to our team at McKinney HR because you've already done a webinar with us. You collaborated with us to talk about negotiation skills in the workplace. And that is actually still on our YouTube channel if anyone wants to go and have a look at that. So we're delighted to have you back and giving us your time today, Malcolm. And what I'm really looking forward to is hearing your perspective on some of the questions that we have.
No problem. It's going to be a pleasure.
Okay, so I'll stop my share there. And I guess opening it up, Malcolm, obviously I've given some facts there about how we are seeing the changing landscape, but what's your view on what's happening today?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's easy to overblow how much change is happening in terms of industrial relations. I think there are a few things going on, and you can see a lot of coverage in the press about industrial actions and strikes, and we've got more strikes this year than we've had for a long time. Yes, that's true. But we've had what 20 years of virtually, in fact, probably more like 25 years of virtually no industrial action, of virtually no real disagreement in workplaces, on the basis that we've had a very stable economy. I'm talking up until the various things like the economic crash and then Brexit and then pandemic and things like that, which have thrown us into a spell of turmoil. And I think it's easy to see what's happening just now disproportionately, because if you go back to the 1980s, you go back to the early 1990s, the levels of industrial action we're seeing still this year are nothing. They're really low. You look at the winter of discontent in 1979, there were over 11.5 million days lost to industrial action. We're about 450,000 lost days this year so far. So it really is quite small in that historical context. So I think it's important that we don't overplay it. Having said that, I think one thing I'm seeing having come out of the pandemic is that there's a much greater awareness of people about what the possibilities are for balancing work with their personal lives. A lot of people saw the possibility of working from home, for example, that they possibly hadn't actually seen before. You know, they'd maybe just sort of thought, well, it's not really possible, it wouldn't work for my kind of job. Then they've actually done it and they kind of thought, oh, actually, that worked quite well for me. It worked quite well for my life. So we've got a few tensions that are growing up around that. And I think partly because you've got managerial pressures, because from my perspective, industries in all sectors across the UK particularly have underinvested in managerial development. So, and that's for decades. You know, if somebody's really good at their job, they get promoted, they're suddenly a manager. Oh, shame, they're not very good as a manager because nobody's ever actually given them the skill set to do it properly. Now, some people are really good at it. Some people don't have the natural skills, so they have to have them trained. But there's a lot of people who are actually feeling quite exposed because they're in this position where not only are they having to manage, but they're having to manage people who are doing hybrid working. They're not in the office all that much. And how do they actually keep on top of things? And in the past, they maybe kept on top of things by keeping everybody within sight. So you could see what everyone was doing and you can have a quick conversation with them. But they don't have that level of confidence and they don't have the skills to underpin it. And you've got this tension growing in that aspect. The other thing that I'm seeing happening is you've got a lot more people from millennial groups and Generation Z who are coming into the workplace. Now, all of the research that's been done says that those generations are much, much more values driven and that things outside of work are much more important to them than work is, which means that there's a tension growing there as well. They're becoming more aware of values that are being espoused by some of the trade unions, and the ones that are being smart about this are adapting their approaches and policies to actually embrace the values that are coming from those generations, because they're seeing that's where their future membership sits. And that means that and I think that's partly where there's this slight uptick in membership coming from. A, it's a greater awareness. B, it's a greater fear that employers are going to take something away that people have come to value over the period since the pandemic, which is effectively flexibility in working. Plus, there's this values piece that's coming in. So I think all of those are coming into play. And at the same time, we've got this generation of managers and human resources people and union officers and union reps, none of whom have had to really deal with large scale dispute. And a big bit of dealing with large scale dispute is actually knowing how not to be dragged into it. So I think, and that to me is where the real skill needs to come now.
Yeah, and we can talk about how to make the interaction more effective and behaviours as well. So, yeah, I think my experience is there's been a bit of fear almost from the management and HR perspective about more trade union presence and having to interact more and holding back from the workplace forum. But the evidence shows that there's so much benefit that can be had from listening to the employee voice.
Yeah, I think there's a big factor in that fear of the unknown. And if you've not worked with them previously, then unions are unknown. Employee forums are unknowns. You get people working in a group. So that fear plays on where people are coming from. Actually, I would say the fact that people are beginning to take a lot more interest in the way their employers run the business should actually be a really good thing because of the amount of knowledge about businesses that sits in the workforce. The employer could be looking or should be looking at these forums as ways of accessing some of that knowledge and actually making their business better using, the intellectual resource that they have at their fingertips, really.
Yeah. So we know that we really need to be promoting having a structure in place. So once you've got a structure in place, and we'll talk about how to do that later, but if you've already got a structure in place for those who have, what are some of the examples of maintaining effective relations between a trade union or workplace forum and management from
Mm.
experience you've had?
Um, from my experience, the word you've used there is the relationship, and to me, that's the absolutely critical thing. Is how do you develop the relationships between the people who are involved in that forum? And I'm not just meaning the elected staff representatives, I'm meaning the managers who are getting involved, the HR people who are either on the panel, on the board, or are supporting it. The other ancillary people around there who are providing the information and maybe doing technical reports. How do you get the relationships that are around that table such that they can actually have a disagreement with each other without falling out? Because if you think about it, you don't agree with your friends all the time. Even if it's about what you're going to go and watch at the cinema, where are you going to go for dinner? So, no, I don't want to go there. I want to go to this other place, and you'll have a conversation about that element of disagreement. But the thing is, you know each other well enough, and you have a strong enough relationship that you can disagree without falling out about it. And that to me is what you kind of need to get to. So to me, it's like any other relationship. You need to work at it. So you need to sort of go, okay, how do I build this relationship? Well, the first thing is by having conversations and not just having conversations about the difficult subjects that you're trying to resolve in the workplace. Just conversations. Get to know them as people. And once you know them as people, then you can start talking about the more difficult subjects in a much more constructive way, and you can actually disagree and have these constructive disagreements, which is what I would always say. These conversations need to aim for. And unless somebody's challenging your position, how do you know you're right? So
Yeah.
to me, to have those disagreements is essential because the more the more you talk them through, if you can convince somebody of a position, or more importantly, if you can understand their disagreement with your position, then perhaps you can adapt where you're going to make it fit better. Or at least at the worst case scenario, you actually know that the thing that you're talking about is more right in your mind than it was before. But having the conversation, being open to the other opinion, I think is a really important starting point.
So curiosity and making sure that there's not assumptions being made as well.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think assumptions are, well, there's the old saying, assume makes an ass of you and me. And there's a lot of truth in that. I think the other thing and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but it's sort of in response to the question you asked comes to mind. That's really important is to actually think about what do you want from this relationship? And I think that's probably one of the key things that I see go wrong in terms of particularly staff forums or employee forums, but also in terms of how people develop a relationship with a union. I've just recently been helping out a law firm with doing some training for an employer that has recognized a trade union for the first time. And they were kind of just going, well, what do we do? So my first question is, well, what do you want the relationship to deliver for you? What do you need from this forum, from this discussion that you're going to be having on regular basis? What's the benefit going to be for the company? because there will be a lot of benefit. As I said earlier, the amount of knowledge that sits within that workforce is immense. And they probably don't just know the things that they encounter every day that make their jobs difficult. They've probably got good ideas on how they actually put those right. So how do you actually access some of that knowledge and use that to make the business run more efficiently, more effectively, and also at the same time give them a real sense of ownership over the job they're doing and the role that they're playing?
Yeah. And thinking about the reps then as well, because often when setting up a workplace forum, you might think about, okay, we want to have some really good reps here. We want them to be able to respond and behave well in the relationship. And I'm
Yeah.
sure you will have come across some excellent reps in your time and others who were maybe less useful in their roles.
Mhm.
You talk through some
Yeah.
examples of what the impact can be of having excellent versus ineffective reps.
Yes. I mean, I can give you probably the ultimate in terms of good that I remember seeing. It was a company that I dealt with for a while in the energy sector. Um, what was very impressive to me was that both the chief executive and the chief operating officer knew that there was one particular union representative who the rest of the workforce basically looked at as the leader. So whenever they had something that the board wanted them to implement or that they needed to do or wanted to do, in terms of a strategic change or operational change, they would always engage with that particular rep. Partly because they knew they were always going to get a very honest answer. As long as they shared the right information and were open and honest with them, then they would get an open and honest response back. But they also knew that if it was going to work, they needed to be on board with it, because the rest of the workforce followed them. And I thought the maturity from the chief executive and the COO for actually appreciating that we're the managers, but they're the leader, and they were completely comfortable with that, and just worked with it. That rep had so much knowledge about the business, about the workforce, about the strategic direction the company was taking, and thoughts about the strategic direction it should take. I mean, they had actually been invited to become part of the board several times, but turned it down, as in the executive board. But turned it down because they enjoyed what they were doing and they wanted to continue in their technical specialist role. But they were excellent, both in terms of the leadership that they showed, but also in terms of the openness and honesty, and that they were able to provide the disagreement, but always in a constructive way. The other way, in terms of the ones that don't tend to work very well, usually I've found that either because they don't have the capabilities, which is usually a training issue. And sometimes that's because they've been a representative for a very, very long time. So the union has trained them when they first became a rep, but that was maybe 25 or 30 years ago. And thinking on most things to do with negotiation, etc., has changed a lot in the meantime. Um, but once somebody's in the role, it's difficult to kind of force them to go in that direction unless they choose to. So it's a question of working out, how do we give this person the opportunities to actually make up the skills that we want to? How do we actually lead them towards the behaviours that we need them to do? Having said that, a lot of the time they develop habitual behaviours which are seen as problematic, but they're developing those behaviours because they're operating usually in an information vacuum. So if they don't have the information that they need in order to make a reasonable claim, for example, say for a pay increase, I look at what inflation has done over the last sort of 2, 3 years. We're about 10% down in terms of real terms increases. I want a 15% pay increase because that recovers what I had and gives me an increase for this year. that logic might stack up until you look at the information about how the business is performing, and actually it's been making losses, and and you've not been wanting to share that. Now, if the company is making losses and they know that, they're not going to do something that's going to compromise the future of their employment. But unless they know that, they're not going to be able to factor that into trying to work out what they need to do, or what they should be looking towards. So there's a mixture there in terms of what you get back is often what you give out. It's like a mirror,
Yeah.
quite very often the problematic union reps are responding to something that they are experiencing from the other side of the table. So you get back what you put in. So as I say, leading behaviour is one way to go with that, but knowledge and sharing of information and actually showing willing go a long way.
That's really interesting because I think sometimes there's a bit of a fear for management as to how much information should be shared.
Yeah,
And I know that being open at the start of the relationship and sharing as much as you feel
yeah,
you can, that's going to
yeah,
cut down on a lot of the unnecessary dialogue, and it'll
yeah.
build trust in the relationship as well.
Yep, yep. I mean, it does take time because to share that level of information involves trust. So you need to build the trust, and it's that whole thing. Trust builds slowly and disappears quickly. So it's trying to get the balance in that. But it's being open about that from the start is a really a good way to go.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, the other thing to remember and always to factor in is that people behave, any person behaves in a particular way for a reason. So if somebody is sort of like you sort of think, oh, see that Dorothy, she's always kicking off. Why is she kicking off? There's something that's triggering that behavior. So being curious as to what's behind that behavior and then realizing that actually that might be triggered by something that I'm doing.
Mhm.
And I remember doing this. I did some training with an airline a few years ago. And I remember speaking after the training with one of the flight operations managers who sort of said, thank you, that's really good. I now understand why we're in dispute with the unions. And I understand that it was me who caused it. Working that kind of thing through. But remember, they behave for a reason. Be curious. What's the reason? And try to understand that.
Yeah, that's a good mindset to have. Yeah.
Mm.
So just before we move on from reps, I saw there was a question actually in the chat from Kerry,
Oh.
which is a really good one. So if you don't get any volunteers to be a rep, what can you do about that?
Oh.
I can give my perspective first, and then
Yeah,
Malcolm, it'd be interesting to hear yours. But we've worked with a client recently who set up a workplace forum, and there was a lot of work went into the role descriptor, and that was
yes,
actually working with the employee champions that we had on the team who were creating
yeah,
the forum with management as well. So it was done together. There was a draft of the descriptor, and then that was run past them to get their feedback. And then
yeah,
there was a recruitment campaign, and a lot of time went into that to make sure that the line management level were promoting it as well. And then there
yeah,
were some conversations so that if people wanted to ask questions about the role, and also trying to show that there will be support for someone in a rep role, because a big factor is being worried about having the time commitment and being
yeah.
released from duties to be able to do that.
Yes.
That's
I,
what's your
I mean, I think that is that is a big factor, and certainly was when I was working in the union. A big factor in getting people to step forward and be reps was whether or not their work would actually be backfilled while they were performing their rep duties. Because organisations have always been, in my experience, very good at sort of saying, "Oh yeah, yeah, we'll release them to go and do that work." But the fact is that their day work builds up in the background while they're away doing things, and they don't get any time to catch up with that in a lot of situations, not always, obviously. Um, I think there is a big fear factor as well, though, because if you've never done it before, it takes a lot of courage to sit down in front of, even if it's not the chief executive that's running the forum. In fact, usually it won't be. It'll usually be sort of resource director or somebody like that who's in that role, or HR director. Um, and it can be quite daunting, particularly for somebody who's a relatively lowly graded member of staff. Um, if there's not been one before, it can feel like you're putting your head above a parapet. And especially if it's a company where, for example, in fact, the one that I've been working on recently, it was a recognition of a trade union that had gone through Central Arbitration Committee referral. So therefore, it was a statutory recognition. So the employer had actually been quite hostile to having a union in place. In some cases, the employers are only putting in place a forum because they have to, so in that circumstance, it might be more difficult for somebody to feel safe to come forward. So there's a psychological safety aspect there to consider. I think I would come back to what I said before about people behave in a way because of a reason. In this case, the behavior is that they're declining to volunteer. Okay, what's the reason behind that? Find out what's going on. I think you'll normally find it's going to be one of those two things. Either they don't have the psychological safety to come forwards, or they don't have the confidence that they can actually get the backfill to their workload. So they're actually going to just be overstretching themselves by coming forwards to do it. Um, it doesn't give a quick fix, but if you can identify what the problem is, then you can actually start working towards making it feel safer. You can actually start having the conversations that allow that to happen. Um, and then you can move towards those, rather than being volunteers, potentially being elected.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think the psychologically safe bit comes from the messaging a lot of the time as well, doesn't it? And then following
Yeah.
up with,
Yeah,
showing the behavior so that the trust can start to build.
absolutely. And if the employer behaves as if they're only doing this because they have to, then it's going to make the workforce much more reluctant to actually get involved in that forum.
Yeah,
And that comes back to the point I said earlier on, whereby if the company has done the thought process about what positives they're actually going to get from this. What is the company gaining from embracing this forum, from this opportunity to increase the diversity of thought that's coming into their decision-making processes, which in itself which should be an improvement. Then if they're reluctant to do that, people will be reluctant to come in. If they look like they're really embracing it as an opportunity, then people will be going, oh, right, this looks like something that will be good to get involved in.
yeah. Excellent. Well, we've talked about sharing of information and how that can be potentially an obstacle. Talked about potentially challenging reps.
Mm.
Are there any other obstacles that you can bring up from your experience, Malcolm, that we
Uh,
are aware of?
um, I think one of the things that always makes forums and interactions between staff groups and an employer, and I'm using staff groups to include a staff forum or a union relationship, um, is lack of preparation on usually on the management side, um, which means that they're going into the conversation. They maybe know what they want to say because there's a message, right? We want to do this, and we're going to tell them that this is what's going to happen. But they're not actually prepared for any kind of conversation about it and pushback. If it's a union situation and there's a negotiation over something, they've not prepared for that negotiation. They just know what their position is. They haven't actually thought through, well, where are the union going to be coming from this? What do the workforce need and want out of this? Have we actually consulted them early enough to make sure that our proposal meet the needs of the workforce as well as what we believe is needed from the corporate level. I don't know if you've ever seen the research that was done by Yoshida, it must be about 20 years ago, but it postulated the iceberg of ignorance, which looked at a typical business, as in large business. I mean, this is more relevant for bigger ones, but is that a typical senior management team will know round about 4% of the problems that their business faces. So the other 96% of problems are known to other people in the structure. So how do you access that knowledge? How do and if you don't access that knowledge, how do you know you're addressing the right problem? And how do you then make sure you've got the right people working on developing the solution to that problem? So there's things like that factor in how you do it. I'm always going on about some other research that came out of Ruskin College in Oxford, which is about decision-making processes. And every chief executive says their staff are their most valuable resource, and they're also usually the most expensive resource. But this research looked at how much of the intellectual capital that you're investing in the workforce is used in making business critical decisions. Want to guess at what it came out with?
Fairly low.
Fairly low, fairly low. Um, I find most people guess between 5 and 10%, knowing that that's fairly low. The actual answer that came out of the research was between 0.5 and 1%.
Wow, okay, I'm quite blown away by that.
Yeah. Okay. And then if you think about those two bits of research, so if you only know 4% of the problems that your business faces, and you're only using between 0.5 and 1% of the knowledge of the people who know the other 96%, how do you know you're solving the right problem in the right way and at the right time?
Yeah.
You just can't. So actually having a forum, having some mechanism and building the relationships that allow you to access that knowledge, bring that diversity of thought to the decision-making process, means that you will end up making better decisions for the growth and future of the business. Now, it's going to be harder work and it's going to take a bit more time, but the outcome is going to be much, much better. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I go with all that.
That's really interesting. I have to look up that research. You've got some great
Mm,
research articles that you recommend,
mm,
Malcolm. So if anyone wants, a list of those, then please do
yeah.
give us a shout because we can share those. Now, I'm conscious of time and I really want to get to focusing on, okay, for those who are thinking about going ahead with a workplace forum or starting to
Mm,
talk to trade unions, how do you go about that in the best way, where to start?
mm,
So you have covered it a little bit, essentially setting out
yeah.
what you want to achieve is step one. And I think
Mm.
senior management buy-in is massive as well. That's so
Yeah.
important. But can you build on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I say, you're thinking about what actually you need to get out of it, but also giving the opportunity for the people who are going to be part of that forum, so the workforce, whether they're represented by a trade union or not, depending on which type of forum you're ending up with. Doesn't really matter. Giving them the opportunity to feed in what the needs are in terms of the organization. What topics are you going to be covering? How do you actually sort of work towards delivering on those needs? That kind of thought process, I'd say, is an essential as a first thing. But then working out, okay, how frequently are you going to meet? And if you've got a good forum, then you won't be wanting to restrict it to just terms and conditions of employment and really basic things. Actually, it's useful to draw in the ideas and knowledge of the workforce on every aspect of running the business. That takes a bit of courage, but it's worth working towards if you go in there. but making sure you've also got those relationships and you give the opportunities to develop the personal relationships that allow you to have those conversations in a more open way. I'd say
Yeah.
looking at the information that's needed, because I always sort of say information is the it oils the machine. Without information, everything will grind to a halt. And there's an ACAS code, I think it's ACAS code number 2, which is on the sharing of information for collective bargaining purposes. Now, there are very, very, very few recognition agreements out there that have any reference to the ACAS code on sharing of information.
That's
There are
interesting.
very few collective bargaining arrangements that I've been involved in over the years that have had an information sharing agreement, for example. So, given how important information is, maybe have a think about from everybody's perspective, what do we need information wise and what do we need to provide in order to make this whole thing work properly?
Yeah.
And then the other thing is just working on the underlying skills. I mean, one of the main areas I'm working on at the moment is training people how to negotiate more effectively, and a lot of that is focused on situations where they're doing collective bargaining. Now, there's a whole set of skills that go into working as a good negotiator, but there's also a whole set of other things that feed into it when it's collective bargaining, because you've got small p politics at work. Once you've got a group of people rather as opposed to an individual, then the way those people interact with each other. So you've got management will not be speaking of one voice. They will have conversations, they will have disagreements amongst the management group. The staff representatives will have disagreements amongst themselves. How do you balance all of those competing voices at the table? And learning how to do all of that is quite important. And I think probably underpinning all of that, the most important skill in all of this is listening. And I have to say, it's something that over the years I found that HR people, and actually I hate to say it, but lawyers as well, tend not to actively listen. It's partly because the nature of business is such that you go to one of the lower levels of listening. There's a model of listening where, the worst form of listening, it says, when you start listening, is waiting for your turn to speak. The next level, so the next level up from that is that you respond with how it impacts on you. I had a terrible journey into work this morning, and then you would respond with, "Oh yeah, I had a terrible journey as well, and I got stuck in the traffic there and whatever." And you're not actually hearing what I'm saying. The next one up is the one that most professional people get stuck in, which is giving advice, because we're so conditioned that somebody comes to you, you get an idea of what the problem is as quickly as you can, and you provide advice that solves the problem. But unfortunately, that means that you're not really listening. Because again, that example, I had a terrible journey into work today. Well, if you got the bus, you might not have been caught in the traffic. Or if you'd managed to catch the train in, it's a bit quicker than the bus and there's all these options. Or if you'd taken that road, whatever. Actually, the reason they had a terrible journey to work this morning was because they woke up, with a really bad headache because it's possibly a cold coming on, and then their children were banging and sort of running around the house, not getting out to work. So they were actually late getting them dropped off at school and getting onto the road to get to work. And so it's all this personal stuff that's actually in the background, but you've not given an opportunity to listen to it. And that person might not actually need the advice, they might just need to be heard. So it's getting conscious about where you are listening, and whether or not is this a conversation where you're looking for advice, or is this a conversation where you're actually needing to just explore, and actually you'll come up with your own answer if you're given the opportunity to explore.
Yeah, very true.
Mm.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time, want to have time for questions. Lindsay, is there anything we've not answered so far in the chat box?
No, I've just had a wee look. No, I can't see anything that's not. Although Malcolm, I have just been cringing there
All
because
right.
that's me giving advice, and I need to really look at that because I don't want people to do that to me. I just want them to listen so that I get it all out. And yeah, I'm fairly guilty of that myself. So I'm going to
Yeah.
give myself a wee hand slap there. Uh,
I would say don't feel bad about it though, because it's the way of modern workplaces is it pushes us to behave like that. So it is when I'm training people how to mediate, when I'm training people how to negotiate, it's one of the commonest things that people do, and that they need to stop doing is giving advice before it's actually
asked for.
landed as to what the problem is.
Sure. Thank you.
Very hard for HR people, I will say.
Yes.
So obviously we have really focused a lot on behaviours and skills, information sharing. So there are some resources just for those of you out there who are thinking about starting off on the journey of getting a structure in place. ACAS has a guide, but what we wanted to do was give you more information on the behavioural side and the obstacles and what it can be like in reality to build on top of that guide. So it's definitely worth looking at that guide, but hopefully what you've got from Malcolm's conversation today will give you a lot more detail about making it effective in reality as well. I mean, from our side of things, we have just finished a project where Hanover, the Housing Association, has implemented a workplace forum, and it's just been fantastic to watch their journey from the start to co-creating it with the employees. And they had us help facilitate it independently, which actually turned out to be quite useful because it really helped that safe space that you've been talking about to get the ideas from the employees. And they used options like going out and getting a survey to find out what people would want to discuss from the employee perspective. And that's what you were talking about, focusing on making sure that you've got that set at the start. But the other big factor that we found was make sure you give enough time to the process as well, because these things are not quick to get set up. And if you rush it, that's when you're going to come up against some of the problems as well. And I'm sure you'll have had some experience of that, Malcolm.
Well, I use it far too much as a phrase, but I always have said to people, do you want it right or do you want it right now? Because you can't have both. So these things, they take time, and especially building a relationship that's got enough trust to work in there. I mean, I reckon you're doing well if you've got a good trusting relationship after a couple of years. So don't rush it. Take your time to build those relationships, do it consciously, and provide time as well to prepare properly. I mean, I've read somewhere that's a report that came out of Harvard College, Harvard University, sorry, Business School, that suggested that for any negotiation that you're going into, you should spend about double the amount of time preparing that you think it's going to take you to do the negotiation. Now, personally, I think that's probably a bit over the top, but I think it does give you a measure of how important preparation is.
Yeah, and I was thinking when you were talking about, management turning up unprepared, how that looks to the reps as well.
Yeah.
They want to feel that management are valuing that process as well. And so that's
disrespectful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, any last tips for HR, Malcolm? Because I'm sure you'll have seen what I think the role is for us,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
how can we do it well?
I just think try to improve your listening skills, because I don't think anybody loses by improving the way they listen. And just remember, people behave in any particular way for a reason. So be curious about what's underlying the way this person's behaving.
That was brilliant. So I'm going to share just the last slide, which has our feedback form. So we're open to take questions after, or if there's anything that Malcolm's talked about that you want to delve into more detail, then give us a shout, because we love this topic. It's really fascinating. But I'm just going to share this. Bear with me. Should have got Lindsay to do this for me.
Hmm.
Okay, so you can use your phone to scan this, and we want to just thank everybody for your time today as well, especially you, Malcolm. So I really hope that we get to have another conversation in the future, because yeah, I can see this is going to be building momentum as things change and we see what actually happens with the impact of the employment bill.
Yes, yes, it is going to be interesting to see what the impacts are from that. Yeah, and what ends up getting passed.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
thanks for taking the time to invite me in and for listening as I speak from my perspective on all of these things. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
You're very welcome, Malcolm. And thanks again to everyone. We'll close off the session now.